Hello to all the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I think we have a fantastic show for everybody, per usual. I want to start with the RP plugs, realprogressives.org. Make sure you're not missing out on any of our content or our educational material over there. If you want to donate, our Patreon is there. Make sure you don't miss any of our podcast or articles, realprogressives.org. So today we are going to discuss, obviously, the reconciliation situation. We have a kind of a crazy story about JFK files, which were supposed to be released before I was born, and were just yet again delayed by the Biden administration. We're going to talk Steven Donziger, who just reported to prison. He's the human rights attorney that successfully sued Chevron. All sorts of great stories for you guys today. Lincoln Project, one of my favorite topics. They're absolutely awful. If you still support the Lincoln Project, as I tweeted the other day, I have many bridges to sell you. We're going to talk about the false flag that they got caught up in. All sorts of great stuff for you today. I do want to start with that Steven Donziger situation. For those that haven't followed the whole story, he sued Chevron for environmental and human rights violations in Ecuador. Successfully. It was a historic lawsuit. And then he was prosecuted on a contempt charge, which is a misdemeanor. And the contempt he's being charged with seems to be absolute and complete bullshit. He basically was protecting his client's privilege by objecting to a discovery request, and that's led to this whole it's insane. It's totally unprecedented. No lawyer has ever been charged in the way that he's been charged. He is now serving 6 months in prison for this. And the other detail that I think often gets left out of this story is that the attorneys that prosecuted him were not prosecutors. It was a private law firm that is employed by Chevron that the judge brought in to prosecute Steven Donziger. So it was not like a prosecutor sat down and said, this case has merit and I'm going to prosecute it. It was private attorneys brought in who represent Chevron. I mean, the conflicts of interest here are absolutely insane. And it kind of, this story speaks to and demonstrates how the sort of like critical legal theory talks about how when you have these institutions, they're going to be designed to maintain the status quo for those who benefit from the status quo. So they're built by those in power to protect those in power. Right. And that's why you see such rampant classism and racism and corruption running through our legal institutions. And this is just a perfect example of that. Chevron gets privileges that no average person or even small business would get. Right. They're just able to get whatever the fuck they want when they've failed, when they've successfully been sued. They get to respond to that in ways that average people do not have the power to. And that's the whole system is built up on that kind of hierarchy. So I want to show you guys a clip here. This is Donziger himself. The morning before the morning he reported to prison, he went on Democracy Now! And spoke with Amy Goodman. This is the first part of that interview. He explains some details about the case and how unprecedented it is, and goes into his story a little bit. So I want to show you guys this clip, and then we'll come back and discuss.
Now, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The environmental human rights lawyer, Steven Donziger, is reporting to jail today after a federal appellate court rejected his request for bail pending his appeal. Earlier this month, Steve Donziger was sentenced to 6 months in prison for contempt of court, a misdemeanor. Donziger has already spent over 2 years under house arrest after being targeted by the oil giant Chevron. The case stems from Steve's role in suing Chevron on behalf of 30,000 Amazonian indigenous people for dumping 16 billion gallons of oil into their ancestral land in the Ecuadorian Amazon. 10 years ago, Ecuador's Supreme Court ordered Chevron to pay $18 billion. The landmark ruling was seen as a major victory for the environment and corporate accountability. But Chevron refused to pay or clean up the land. Instead, it launched a legal attack targeting Donziger. In July, a federal judge found him guilty of 6 counts of criminal contempt of court after he refused to turn over his computer and cell phone. In an unusual legal twist, the judge appointed a private law firm with ties to Chevron to prosecute Donziger after federal prosecutors declined to bring charges. Amnesty International recently called for his immediate release, saying he was being arbitrarily detained. The UN's Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has also called for his release. Well, as he prepares to report to prison later today, Steve Donziger is joining us from his home in New York, where he's been under house arrest for 813 days. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., there'll be a major news conference held today outside the Capitol. Steve Donziger, welcome back to Democracy Now! Where are you heading to prison today? We're talking about a misdemeanor. You've already been under house arrest for nearly 1,000 days.
It's just extraordinary, Amy. Thank you for the introduction. I mean, it pretty much captured it. What I'll say is I have to report to prison by 4:48 p.m. today, which is in itself highly unusual. I don't believe I'm guilty. No lawyer has ever spent more than 90 days in home confinement, maximum sentence ever given to a lawyer, convicted of my charge, which is misdemeanor contempt. I've already spent over 8 times that at home. And now on top of that, Judge Preska's trying to put me in prison for 6 months. And, another unusual feature is she's making me report within 24 hours after this latest court ruling that came down yesterday, rather than allowing me time to report, in a normal course to a prison. So there's so much about this.
And which prison are you going to be held at?
I don't know yet. By forcing me in so quickly, Judge Preska, I believe, is trying to force me into a local federal jail that I think is very unsafe. I mean, I have no security risk at all. I've never been convicted. It's the lowest level offense. So normally I would go to a federal prison camp. And, we need time for the Bureau of Prisons to designate me to an appropriate facility. Instead, she's trying to force me very quickly, I think, into a local jail, which concerns me greatly, frankly. And I think that's one reason why Amnesty International put out an urgent action bulletin 2 days ago for people to write to the Attorney General Garland to just stop this case. I mean, the other crazy thing about this that is so disturbing, Amy, is that I was not prosecuted by the U.S. government. I was prosecuted by a private law firm, Seward and Kissel, appointed by a federal judge after the U.S. government declined to prosecute me. And the judge never disclosed that the law firm had Chevron as a client. So essentially, I'm being prosecuted by a Chevron law firm, a partner in a Chevron law firm, a private law firm, who deprived me of my liberty. I'm the only person ever charged with this offense held pre-trial at home or in prison. Never happened before for even a day. It's over 800 days. So, this is the first corporate prosecution in U.S. history. I have never seen a case like this, nor have other legal experts that work with me. And, we just think, to restore the rule of law as regards Steve Donziger and the people of Ecuador, this case has to be stopped and taken over by the Department of Justice. I mean, they could do what they want with it. I mean, if they want to prosecute me, but I need to be prosecuted by a neutral prosecutor, not by Chevron.
So they went on to cover some more details, but I wanted to make sure you guys got the bones there. It's absolutely insane, totally unprecedented, and it's kind of a revelation and an admission on behalf of the legal system that it serves the powerful, it serves corporations, it serves the rich, and it is not really intended to find justice. It's intended to maintain that status quo for those who currently enjoy it, because that's who built the institution, right? This is, again, critical legal theory, important stuff. I will again plug, I've plugged it a few times, but I talked to Ira Miose Frimpong about critical race theory, and we started that discussion by discussing critical legal theory. And he went into some Oliver Wendell Holmes and how formalism is absolute nonsense. It's just not how things operate, even if we wish it was. So anyway, I think it's a very important topic matter, because it expands beyond specifically the legal theory or specifically race. Taking this critical look at society and looking at how systems and institutions operate, I think is such an important aspect of anybody's worldview and anybody's political ideology. So I hope that something changes here, but I doubt it's going to. I think that Steven Donziger is going to have to serve out 6 more months in prison after nearly 1,000 days on house arrest. And I think it's very clear that nothing close to justice was done in this case. What happened was, a sycophantic judge capitulated to Chevron, and that's what the legal system does again. And Donziger here is the victim. It's meant to intimidate other lawyers who might have thoughts about suing a big corporation or a big bank or some other, anyone big enough it's kind of like a too big to fail concept in not quite, but like if you cross a certain threshold, the legal system is going to jump through hoops to try to make sure that it's serving you and not try to, find justice in any particular case. This is utterly insane. Utterly insane. It's a plain violation of his rights to be prosecuted by Chevron's own law firm. That's like, how is that possibly legal? Total loss for words on this one. Shame on that judge. Shame on that judge. Shame on Chevron. Shame on that law firm. Every participant in this is in the wrong. And again, quite a revelation for how things work. And I also have a feeling, you guys, that as unprecedented as this is, I have a feeling that smaller versions of this probably occur quite regularly. It just might not actually amount to the public, explicit, you're going to prison for 6 months kind of a thing. But these pressures trickle down in so many different ways to attorneys and to judges. The whole system is built to prop up the powerful and allow them to maintain their power and their wealth and their influence over society. So this is a shameful situation, especially considering Chevron, we've gotten all this evidence that these big oil companies have known for decades what they're doing to the planet and just covered it up and lied about it. And to this day, in many cases, played dumb and refused to admit it. And as we see the catastrophic results of climate change, and as people are starting to legitimately feel it, especially, by the way, impoverished people in marginalized communities, and often indigenous communities end up feeling it first, because where do oil companies go to run their pipelines, right? Whose land do we often destroy first? It's the indigenous communities' land. So you see marginalized communities and impoverished communities paying the price for Chevron's conduct. And then when once in a blue moon, the exception to the rule, when they actually lose a lawsuit for this behavior, what do they get to do? They get to turn around and act in vindictive ways towards the attorney who successfully defeated them in court. Right. So this is meant as a warning shot to any other attorney that would dare challenge the powerful. And I hope it doesn't work. I hope that other attorneys continue to push forward, as little as that is in the grand scheme of things, right? Like winning one lawsuit against Chevron as compared to like all these systemic climate change issues and corruption issues and capitalism is a whole fucking thing, right? But anything you can do to chip away at it, I want to see attorneys attempt to, and it would be a real shame if this kind of intimidation worked. So I wish Steven and his family all the best. I can't imagine what he has gone through and will continue to go through for another 6 months. And I can only hope that as some consolation that his career is, takes off and continues to bring him success after this. I hope that this being such a public case, perhaps he can, find a couple other Chevrons of the world to take down, and hopefully bring some publicity to that so that we can, try to get the ball rolling on some of this stuff a little bit. So I wanted to talk about these JFK files. This is a really wild situation, you guys. In 1992, that is before I was born, the JFK Act passed, which essentially said that documents pertaining to his assassination would be made public. It is now 2021, and the Biden administration has once again delayed the release of those files. And obviously, this is just my opinion, but I obviously think something is incredibly suspicious about the story we were told about JFK. I do not think that we were told the whole story. I do think it's incredibly and overwhelmingly likely that the intelligence community was involved in assassinating JFK. It's just there's too much circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction. So that they refuse to release these files would seem to indicate that that's probably the case, right? Why else wouldn't they? If it just confirmed that that it was a one-man situation, which is what the official reports found. If that was confirmed by these files, they'd release them, right? I mean, it's just it makes it certainly emboldens the conspiracy theories surrounding JFK's assassination. I'll put it that way. So this is in CBS News. White House delays release of JFK assassination files, quote, to protect against identifiable harm, end quote. The White House said Friday it would delay the release of long classified documents related to the assassination of former President John F. Kennedy. President Joe Biden wrote in a statement that the remaining files, quote, shall be withheld from full public disclosure until December 15th of next year, nearly 60 years after Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas in 1963. In 2017, former President Donald Trump released several thousand secret files on the assassination, but withheld others on national security grounds. The White House said the National Archivist needs more time for a review into that redaction, which was slowed by the pandemic. I don't understand that one bit. We're 60 years into this. You need more time? Give me a fucking break. That is such a ridiculous excuse. Mr. Biden also said the delay was necessary to protect against identifiable harm to the military, defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the conduct of foreign relations, and that this outweighs the public interest in immediate disclosure. Unreal. The assassination of the 46-year-old president was a profound national tragedy that continues to resonate in American history and in the memories of so many Americans who were alive on that terrible day, the statement said. A 10-month investigation led by then Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had lived in the Soviet Union, they have to throw that in there, right? Acted alone when he fired on Kennedy's motorcade. But the commission's investigation was criticized for being incomplete, with a congressional committee later concluding that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. So even a congressional committee found this, you guys. It's entirely unbelievable that this was a solo act. It just is. And it never ceases to amaze me that the press will throw in the who used to be in the Soviet Union. Like, what does that have to do with anything outside of your attempt to, engage in baiting people into fearing Russia? This is McCarthyism that we are still dealing with in 2021, and the media routinely engages in this, right? It's such a contrast to, this is just a total side note, but do you guys remember in, I don't remember which year it was, but one of the years Obama ran, it was against Romney, so that would have been 2012. He said to Romney on the debate stage, he said, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back. And that was because Romney had engaged in McCarthyism. How quickly it went from that in 2012 to Russia being basically the Democrats' entire fucking messaging strategy, right? It's absolutely hilarious. But anyhow, this is, like I said, this emboldens the idea that we did not ever know the real truth about JFK's assassination. And I think that's quite obvious. We all know the intelligence community engages in things that are unpalatable, to say the least. And we all know that they cover that up, and they're given a particular authority to do so under the guise of national security. So they basically get to redact and censor things that otherwise would be part of these releases. So, and they mentioned there that Trump's administration had released some of them, but the point is that they also redacted a bunch of them. So that's not really a release, right? You clearly released what you thought was acceptable and held back anything that might have actually harmed the image of the intelligence community or the country. And it's a real shame. It both confirms that the powers that be in this situation are clearly lying and were clearly involved. I mean, just think about that, you guys. The intelligence community involved in assassinating a sitting president. Like, just think about the implication of that. It's insane. It's really insane. So that in and of itself is a shame that we have this situation where the deep state effectively can do what the hell they want, and there's no even perceived democratic pressure on them. And the other shame is, quite frankly, this will also embolden like totally nuts conspiracy stuff, right? Like, anytime that you refuse to be transparent, you basically confirm to anybody whose initial tendency is to be skeptical of everything. You basically confirm to them, it's all some conspiracy. It's all some, right? And like I just said, I very much think that there are lies involved here. And I do think there's a conspiracy involved here. But there are also plenty of conspiracies that are just wacko, totally detached from reality. And when you continually behave like this, you build up that institutional distrust that makes people start from that place that allows them to build into these conspiracy theories. So like they're basically harming narratives and our political rhetoric in every way possible. The discourse is being harmed on both sides by this lack of transparency, if that makes any sense at all. I worded that very weird. But I think you guys get what I'm saying, right? They're both building up the conspiratorial nonsense and also proving that some of that distrust is coming from a very real and organic and understandable and reasonable place. So it's an absolute shame. And there are a number of these, you guys. Like I'm far from a fucking truther, but I do not think the 9/11 Commission gave us an honest answer about what happened on 9/11, right? I think there's some incredibly fishy things about the report that we got on what happened on September 11th. So like there's a number of these where you let these crazy theories spiral out of control, and you kind of throw gasoline on them by refusing to engage in any form of transparency at all, and by admitting that you are actually engaged in all this nefarious shit, right? But crazy that we're 60 years or almost 60 years since he was assassinated, and we are almost 30 years since the law passed, the JFK Act passed, that demanded that this be revealed, and it still has not been. It's what do you say about it? And then also just, this should go without saying, they say it's going to be released in next December. I mean, if you believe that, gullible's written on the ceiling, right? They'll just come out with a statement in December. Nope. We haven't had enough time to review yet. The archivist needs more time. Some bullshit, right? 60 years, not quite long enough. Maybe we'll have it ready in 70 years. Takes a long time. Insane. Who's believing that? Like, they couldn't even come up with a better lie. They couldn't even come up with a better excuse. It's kind of pathetic and pitiful, isn't it? Unbelievable. So I do want to talk a little bit about the reconciliation situation. I know this one is something we kind of have to cover every week because it's like the big bill being negotiated right now, and it gets somewhat tiresome to constantly come back every week and basically tell you guys that more of it has been gutted and that it was inadequate to start with, and it's never good news on this shit. But we do have an interesting development. This is in the Uprising. Sources: Nancy Pelosi kicked out of meeting with House Progressive Caucus amid tense budget talks. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi apparently found herself persona non grata at a meeting of the Congressional Progressive Caucus on Thursday as she attempted to persuade left-wing Democrats to sign off on bipartisan infrastructure legislation. Multiple sources confirmed to the Uprising that Pelosi was kicked out of the meeting by Progressive Caucus Chairwoman Pramila Jayapal. She got kicked out, and she said she was leaving anyway, a Democratic staffer who was granted anonymity to discuss the confidential meeting said of Pelosi. Spokespeople for Pelosi and Jayapal did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Of course they didn't. Pelosi was observed entering the meeting and leaving just over 10 minutes after she walked in. The speaker did not answer questions from reporters as she left. After the story was published, Pelosi's Deputy Chief of Staff, Drew Hamill, disputed the characterization of her departure. Of course he did. So clearly she was kicked out. I don't know if you guys saw, there was a very short clip of her leaving this meeting, and she didn't say anything, but she clearly was very unhappy. Pelosi does not exactly hide how she's feeling most of the time, and this was one of those cases. She looked angry, downright angry. So I think she was kicked out. And you know what? Good on the progressives. I bitch and moan all the time when they don't put their foot down in any way, shape, or form, and I will give them a credit when they give this little modicum of pushback. Okay, it's not nearly enough. I wish they would just use their leverage and their numbers to just force this to, which is effectively what they're trying to do. But I wish they would be much more bold in how they go about these things. I wish they would force votes on things all the time. I mean, we've discussed this ad nauseum, right? But it's good to see that they're at least not completely capitulating to Pelosi like they have in the past on certain issues. And it's good to see that there are many of them who are not going to vote for this, and Bernie too in the Senate. So and since the Senate's 50-50, this is one thing that gets left out of the mainstream discussion entirely, and quite frankly, not mentioned enough in independent media. Bernie Sanders has just as much power as Joe Manchin. He can tank a bill just like Joe can. And this is what I hate about the framing of all of this shit, you guys. The mainstream press treats Joe Manchin like he's this reasonable, principled, moderate fella, right? And then they treat Bernie like he's this extreme, crazy radical. So how does that frame it when either of them go to say, like when Manchin says, I will tank this bill if you don't give me tax cuts for billionaires or whatever, or deregulation or some conservative corporatist horseshit, right? Whatever it might be. The press treats that like it's totally normal and he's just representing his conservative state and yada, yada, yada. If Bernie or the squad threaten to tank a bill or even imply that they might consider tanking a bill, the media just loses their ever-loving fucking minds. And oh, they want to get nothing done. They're gonna tank the whole thing, right? Yada, yada, yada. Yet what happens like every time this budget ceiling situation that we've been talking about comes up? What happens? The corporatists politicize it and use it as leverage for their shitty agenda. And how does the mainstream media cover that? So you see quite a contrast here in how this has been portrayed by the media. And the progressives are always demonized and need to know that they always will be and should have known that going in. You know, that's why it's not like it's an excuse for their lack of action. It's just worth explaining those media dynamics, right? So again, I'm thrilled to see some form of pushback. The 1.75 is obviously grossly inadequate. The 3.5 was grossly inadequate, you guys. The 6 was grossly inadequate, you guys. We need 10 plus. And more importantly than even the top line number 10, I get that number from the civil engineers who basically said we would need to spend 10 immediately just to get our infrastructure up to par. That's not even really getting into a bunch of the climate stuff. That's not getting into the human infrastructure stuff, like education and childcare and healthcare, right? So like, if you want to do those things, it should be more than 10. That's just on the top line. 3.5 was a gross compromise to start with, right? So 1.75 is nowhere close to adequate. I'm glad that they're putting their feet down. And again, I'm sure end up criticizing them soon when they fold in a way that I find displeasing, but I will give them the credit right now for at least seeming to be willing to take up this fight. And Bernie too. Bernie's been very vocal about certain parts of this bill that he does not think should be cut, and he is apparently supportive of this bill being tanked. We should not pass it. Absolutely not. And obviously, and I know I've been over this before, but just in case anyone doesn't understand the dynamics here, the reconciliation bill is the only bill that has anything remotely good in it. Again, grossly inadequate. The infrastructure bill, the bipartisan bill, is just a piece of garbage, literally. It's just a handout to the wealthy. It's garbage. It's a terrible bill. So the reason progressives are willing to, they're pairing those bills together. They're saying, we will not give you your corporate handout unless you also do this, right? And of course, the cinemas and the mansions and the Republicans of the world want those bills decoupled, because then the moment that they pass the infrastructure bill, there's no more leverage for progressives to get the reconciliation bill done. And Manchin and Sinema can basically tell them to piss off. So for those that don't understand the dynamic, that is where we currently stand, is that there's a refusal right now to vote for the infrastructure bill in an attempt to demand that a better reconciliation bill and assurances from the corporatists that they will vote for that reconciliation bill. And one last thing that I really wanted to note on the media coverage of this stuff, you guys, do not call them centrists. Do not call them moderates. They are conservative corporatists. Okay. And oh shit, I meant to cue this clip up. Now realizing I forgot to, Mehdi Hassan absolutely drilled Joe Lieberman on this. And he put up polling and he said, listen, it was, I don't know, 8 or 9 of the core pieces of the initial $3.5 trillion bill. And he showed the polling on them. Some of them were in the 80s, like 83, 84% approval, some in the 70s, some in the 60s, all of them like over 65% approval, which is a strong majority. So the point that Mehdi was making was, Joe, you can't call yourself a centrist while you oppose this incredibly popular agenda. This stuff is by definition down the center if 80% of the country wants it. You can't call something fringe if 80% of the country wants it. You can't treat that like it's an extreme policy. So how are you the centrist when you're rejecting what is clearly a moderate policy, something that the voters approve of, by definition moderate? And Joe had a terrible response. He tried to say centrism isn't an ideology, it's a strategy, and he deflected, just obfuscated away from the challenging question that he for once was presented on corporate media. So I wanted to make sure everybody kind of just rejects that general idea of calling these fucking people centrists or moderates. They're corporatists. That's what they are. And it's an extreme position to say, I oppose 84% of the country or 78% of the country or whatever. You're in the fringe on the right. You're extreme right. I don't care if you put a D next to your name on this policy belief. You're on the extreme right, and you're trying to tank an incredibly popular and moderate piece of legislation, right? So, and this all goes back to like the general framing of all this stuff, that a reconciliation bill like this would be framed as a lefty position is insane, along the same lines of what I was just talking about. It's moderate at best. It's like center right on the world stage, you guys. Like, the Democrats are a conservative party on the world stage. And actually, on that note, the Build Back Better bullshit that they keep, they clearly think it's effective. I don't understand how it's one of the worst phrases I've heard in my entire life, and but it was stolen by the Tories in the UK. It tells you all you need to know about where the Democrats actually sit on the political spectrum. Another connection there: after Hillary lost, a bunch of her top campaign aides went and worked for Theresa May, who was the conservative candidate in the UK. The Democrats and the Tories actually line up pretty nicely on a lot of issues. So that it just tells you how like extreme to the right our political framing is in this country. And this reconciliation coverage has been a very nice example of that. So I hope that they hold firm. I really do. As it pertains to this bill. So fingers crossed, but I'm not naive enough to expect it. Let's hope they stand firm and get whatever they possibly can get out of it. This is just to again detail what specifically we're talking about here. We're talking about childcare. We're talking about guaranteed paid leave for sick leave and parental leave. We're talking about tuition-free community college, things that would tangibly affect people's everyday lives. We're talking about expanding Medicare and Medicaid. We're talking about including vision and dental and more in Medicare. Like that concept alone, and I finally saw some mainstream coverage of this because I've been saying this forever. Why are teeth and eyes considered not part of your body? Like, did we separate? Are my eyes not part of my health? It's utterly insane. Whoever decided to separate dental and vision from healthcare was clearly a capitalist, like clearly an insurance executive or some shit. Because there's no sense there. There's no logic there at all. And of course, Democrats been promising these kinds of things forever. They've been running, you guys, they've been running on the prescription the drug reform, like reforming. Let me step back. Totally word saladed that. They've been running on allowing Medicare to negotiate better drug prices for like 15 years. It's one of the most popular policies that they talk about during elections. And what's one of the first things they fucking pull out of this bill when Joe Manchin says he doesn't want to pay for it? I mean, it's so pathetic. It is so pathetic. If the Democrats weren't in such positions of power, I would legitimately pity them because they are so pathetic. So, well, I'm holding out some hope that we'll get some good things here, but I'm not naive enough to expect it. And this bill as it stands right now, just don't pass the infrastructure bill. There's no reason to. It's a piece of shit. So if it's basically between passing the infrastructure bill right now and or holding out with some chance of getting a better reconciliation bill, I don't even care if we get the better reconciliation bill. The choice is obvious right now, right? Tank the infrastructure bill, and then we can hope to get what the best we can out of the reconciliation situation. So we'll see if they hold firm. I want to show you guys here a thread on Twitter by Alec Karakatsanis. I'm sorry if I butchered that name. He posts all the time about legal issues and the so-called justice system. And I wanted to read you guys this thread. This is just fantastic. It's about the very concept of imprisoning people and the efficacy of how we quote unquote rehabilitate prisoners at this point. This thread is about two facts. First, human caging kills. Each year in custody reduces a person's life duration by 2 years. Second, it is a scientific fact that human caging does not reduce crime. These two facts are not widely known, and that is a failure of judges and media. First, take a moment to let this sink in. We know that caging people kills them. Every time a judge jails someone on cash bail or sentences them to prison, the judge is literally killing the person sooner. And he's got links and threads and things here that he's posting to back up what he's saying, but I'm just going to go over the gist of it. Second, social scientists who study incarceration disagree on a lot, but the thing that the entire research community agrees on is that human caging do not reduce crime. This is an incredible finding that is almost entirely absent from media reporting. Third, mainstream media engages in something like climate change denial with these facts. Earlier this year, the New York Times let its San Francisco bureau chief fabricate a shoplifting surge and then speculate to readers that it was caused by reducing prison sentences. Fourth, reporting like this kills people and way more than you might think. The main study on the issue of data from 1981 to 2007 found that total U.S. life expectancy was lower by an average of 1.8 years because of mass incarceration versus other countries. Fifth, it is hard to overstate this finding. The extreme use of human caging in the U.S. causes the entire national average life expectancy to be lower by almost 2 years. This is hundreds of millions of years by living one of the great mass tragedies of the modern world. Sixth, despite these calamitous public health results, elite bureaucrats and media continue to push for more spending on cops, prosecutors, judges, prisons, probation, parole, without ever confronting basic data about safety. Finally, it's important to ask yourself why public officials and media supposedly concerned with public safety have created an environment in which almost no one knows these facts. Why? It's vital to change how we talk about safety. Fantastic thread there. And for those that hadn't previously understood those facts, I think those are incredibly important facts. We know that policing and imprisonment do not actually decrease crime. The recidivism rate in this country is through the roof. If you actually want to decrease crime, what you do is you provide basic social programs to people. You provide them with good health care and education and housing, and you make sure that the economy is such that people have jobs. You provide them mental health care. You provide rehabilitation. If you actually want to cut down on crime and on homelessness and poverty, these are the things that you do. If you want to create a state of poverty for much of the community that's just in perpetuity, then you prosecute those communities. You throw them in jail and think that you're going to fix them. It never ceases to amaze me that we actually still call a lot of prisons in this country rehabilitation centers. There's nothing about it that's rehabilitation. There's really not. Grossly inadequate funding for counseling and mental health care for inmates. Grossly underfunded is education opportunities for inmates or internship opportunities for inmates, so that when they get out of prison, they can build on that. They have something to build on, right? We also have this system where it's nearly impossible if you have been convicted of certain things to get housing or to get employment if you are a convict, right? We disallow felons from voting. There's so much systemic oppression that is tied to our so-called justice system, and this is a significant part of it. That this is how we handle crime. And again, you could reduce crime, you could nip it right in the bud. I'm not saying it would happen immediately, but over the course of time, if you implemented better social programs, you would get rid of a lot of crime. No one's saying you can get rid of all of it. You'd get rid of a whole hell of a lot of it. And then we can have these difficult conversations of who actually needs to be separated from society and how do we want to treat them. we can have those difficult conversations if we've nipped the bulk of the crime in the bud by actually providing a better and more healthy and, a society that actually provides people with opportunities instead of punishing them when they find themselves, neglected by our social institutions and our economic institutions, legal institutions. So great work from Alec. If you don't follow him, I recommend you do. It's at Equality Alec. All sorts of fantastic information and, keeping perspective where it needs to be as it pertains to the way that police and our prison system operate and the way our judicial system operates, right? We have a few stories along these lines today. Like we talked Donziger earlier, and we're also going to talk later today about the Rittenhouse trial and how biased the judge is in that trial. So a lot of this classism and racism and misogyny and all these, it's corruption. It's all cooked into these institutions from the get-go. And that again is that critical look at these social issues. So fantastic thread there from Alec, and major props to him for that. Want to talk a little bit here about the Lincoln Project. Those who have followed my show for a long time or have paid any attention at all to the Lincoln Project know exactly what they are. They're right-wing grifters. They're also quite racist, and they also covered up for a groomer who was a top member of the Lincoln Project. He was grooming teenage boys and sexually assaulting them. And the Lincoln Project covered up for this. Emails revealed that. They're just awful people, war criminals. They worked in the Reagan administration, Bush Sr., Bush Jr. administrations. Awful people. And it was very obvious from the jump what they were actually doing. They figured out that Trump was a moneymaker. So what they would do is if they actually wanted to impact elections, they would have gone to the swing states, correct? But they one example, they put up a huge billboard in New York City about Trump. So what are you really doing? You're trying to market to liberals so that they'll donate to you. You're grifting. You're taking money from liberals to say orange man bad. It's so simple, and it's sad that people fall for it, but it's so simple. And then they would turn around and they would spend a lot of that money on consulting firms and shit like that they were part owners in, or that their associates ran, or it was just rank corruption and grifting. This is what they've done from the jump. And I think this whole time, what they have wanted to do in a bigger picture sense is earn some trust with the quote unquote liberals, the MSNBC crowd. And you can do that now just by saying Trump bad. All of a sudden they'll love you, right? So I think they wanted to earn a little bit of trust there and then use that to pull that crowd towards the right-wing policies. Seems pretty obvious and straightforward, and it's astounding to me that more people, or that so many people, fell for their shenanigans and donated to him anyway. This is in The Guardian. Lincoln Project members pose as white supremacists at Virginia GOP event. 5 members carried tiki torches at a campaign stop for Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate for Virginia governor. So they basically were caught in a false flag here, you guys. Hilarious. The Lincoln Project has confirmed it was behind a political stunt in which 5 members posed as white supremacists carrying tiki torches at a campaign stop for Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate for governor in Virginia and Charlottesville ahead of Election Day next week. Members of the anti-Trump Republican group stood in front of Youngkin's campaign bus on Friday wearing T-shirts, khaki pants, and sunglasses. They were attempting to evoke an infamous far-right torch-lit march at the University of Virginia in August 2017, a day before a self-described neo-Nazi killed a counter-protester with his car. As the Lincoln Project mounted the stunt, jurors in a civil lawsuit over the rally were beginning to hear testimony. Days ahead of polling day in a state where Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by 10 points last year, McAuliffe and Youngkin are neck and neck. Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Barack Obama, and other senior Democrats have turned out for McAuliffe. And if you guys haven't seen those clips, it is just as cringeworthy and nauseating as you would expect. Fearing defeat might foreshadow reverses in next year's midterm elections. In comments to NBC 29 after the incident, but before the Lincoln Project claimed responsibility, Youngkin said he thought his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, a former Virginia governor seeking to return to the role, had sent the men. Quote, "They'll do anything to win," he said, and he's doing anything to win. And so he's paying people to show up and act silly at our rallies. Now, notice what the Lincoln Project has actually done here. They've actually helped Youngkin quite a bit. And listen, I could honestly, like, this race means virtually nothing to me because Terry McAuliffe is so fucking awful. Okay. Youngkin, I'm sure, is terrible too, but Terry McAuliffe is like, I mean, he's right-wing corporatist Democrat. And you know, Virginia, by the way, even though they are a light blue state, have some of the worst labor and employment laws in the country, some of the worst economic results in terms of like the wealth gap and things like that. So they've fully embraced the woke left policy stuff while entirely neglecting any economic progressivism. And that's exactly what Terry McAuliffe is. Like, exactly what Terry McAuliffe is. So I really could give a fuck about this race. I could give a fuck about it. But this story is fascinating because the Lincoln Project, there's something about them that I have to cover them when they do shit like this. They just rub me so wrong. And I think this is also like a warning to other groups that might consider similar conduct. Because look what's actually now, what dynamic have they now created? Youngkin now gets to do the Trump thing, right? And see, they're so corrupt, they're so this and that. So now he gets to flip it on McAuliffe and say, look at all these liberals, right? So it's a warning in basic strategy not to do this kind of nonsense. And it's laughable and pathetic anyway. But you know, not the kind of shit that you want to engage in if you actually have your sights set on winning an election. And again, the Lincoln Project don't support these kinds of groups, you guys. Awful. And not at all like even liberal. They're just out and out right wing. So part of me actually thinks maybe this is like, maybe there's 2 layers to this false flag. Maybe they did it on purpose, and now they get to help Youngkin while pretending that they're trying to help McCall. I don't even know. It just they're so crazy and out there, and I don't know. It actually kind of disheartened me to see as little faith as I have in the cable news crowd, the MSNBC crowd, the liberals, the Democrats, etc. It just on a human level, it so disheartened me to see how easily they were duped into supporting anything that was perceived as anti-Trump. That just became a dividing line, like a cultural conflict dividing line, where if you said Trump bad, if you said Orange Man bad, it didn't matter like who you were or what you believed or what you'd done. Didn't matter. They would all adore you, right? We rehabilitated George W. Bush. And believe, like it was during Bush's presidency that I started to pay any attention to politics at all. And I remember, you guys, the liberals felt about Bush not quite how they felt about Trump, but like Bush was hated even by partisan Democrats. Like he was hated. And then as soon as he said some critical things of Trump, rehabilitate George W. Bush, right? So I was disheartened by how easy it was to dupe human beings into horrific beliefs and supporting bad actors and grifters just by saying Orange Man bad. And perhaps I'm naive in that sentiment, but it was very discouraging to me for a litany of reasons. So I mentioned Kyle Rittenhouse earlier. And I want to talk about the bias that the judge in that case has displayed. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the case. Rittenhouse murdered people across state lines with a rifle and murdered people. And now he is on trial for it. I hope everyone is prepared for Rittenhouse to go free. This is in the Nation. Even if Rittenhouse somehow draws an impartial jury, he already appears to have landed a very partial judge. The trial of teenage gunman. Oh, and by the way, I just want to note before we even dive in, look at that picture of this guy. In many cases, for people who, for example, an impoverished black person who's sitting in court will often be in a jumpsuit, jail jumpsuit. So right off the bat, you have this optic that is beneficial to the white supremacist sack of fucking excrement that killed a couple people over his racist views. Right away, the legal system right here telling you which side it's on and what it's there to prop up and the role it's playing here. The trial of teenage gunman Kyle Rittenhouse begins next week, but the fix is already in. Rittenhouse, who was being tried as an adult, shot 2 people dead in the street in Kenosha, Wisconsin during the protests that followed the shooting of Jacob Blake in 2020. That he killed 2 people is undisputed, but Rittenhouse claims the homicides were justified acts of self-defense. Absolutely absurd. Anyone who's followed the story knows that. Rittenhouse is not from Kenosha. He went there with other armed men, allegedly to defend a place called Car Source, which I point out just to emphasize that he wasn't even trying to protect his own property in his own town. Once there, he began patrolling the streets with an assault rifle, illegally gifted him by an older friend. I find the claim that Rittenhouse subsequently murdered 2 unarmed people in self-defense to be unconscionable. I agree. In a just world, Rittenhouse would go to jail for a double homicide and illegal gun possession. That is correct. But we do not live in a just world. We live in a white one. Rittenhouse has become a cause celebre. I think cause celeb. There we go. I knew it was in there somewhere. Among white supremacists and their media sympathizers who have proudly defended Rittenhouse's decision to kill. Rittenhouse is the very definition of an outside agitator who came into someone else's community armed to do violence just because he murdered. While white, he will probably walk free. That reality is almost assured because even if Rittenhouse somehow draws an impartial jury, he has already won the white people's lottery and landed a very partial white judge. Wisconsin State Judge Bruce Schroeder has presided over the Rittenhouse case from the beginning and has done nearly everything he can to tilt the scales of justice in Rittenhouse's favor. This week, in the last pretrial conference, Schroeder declared that prosecutors are not allowed to refer to the people Rittenhouse murdered as victims during the trial. He said victims is too loaded a term, as if there were some other words we should use for unarmed people who were shot to death. Now, there is a progressive, this is the key part right here, you guys. Now, there is a progressive argument for not calling victims of homicide victims at trial. And I actually agree with that, but we're going to get to why it's improper in this case. I can absolutely see the argument that using the term in a case where the defendant claims self-defense lacks neutrality. It's a choice other judges have made, though I doubt that this kind of neutrality would be given to a black teen who gunned down people at a MAGA rally. 100% correct. Still, I wouldn't call Judge Schroeder biased for this ruling alone. I call Schroeder biased because at the same conference at which he decided to prohibit the prosecution from using the word victims to describe the people Rittenhouse shot, he said he would allow the defense to use words like rioters, looters, and arsonists to describe those same people. So do you see what the judge is saying here? Schroeder is saying victim is too loaded of a phrase, but to call them rioters and looters and arsonists is somehow not loaded? Utterly insane, and a very clear demonstration of bias here from Judge Schroeder. And as the article notes, Rittenhouse has already won the white person lottery in this particular regard. So I agree with the sentiment that I hope that there is some form of justice or accountability here. He clearly murdered 2 people. He clearly crossed state lines with the intent of committing violence against people, and clearly is connected to and associated with some very unpalatable groups. The key point that they made here is this is not how it would be treated if this was a black teenager who crossed state lines and shot 2 people at a MAGA rally. It's just not, and we all know that. So we'll keep covering the story as it develops, but it's unfortunate to see that the judge in this case is clearly quite biased. And I think Kyle Rittenhouse has a good shot of escaping any form of justice or accountability for what he did. So at this point, I would like to bring in my guest today. Regular viewers will remember. Oh, did he disappear there? Let's see if we can get him back. Oh, I was muted there. We're having a little trouble getting Kennedy on the stream here. He was on and then fell off. But regular viewers, if you remember Kennedy Carter, he's with Real Progressives. He has some fantastic outside the box views on employment and work and all sorts of things. Hopefully, we'll have him back here soon to discuss that. In the meantime, I'll just go ahead and jump to the next story and see if we can get Kennedy back here. Apologies, you guys. I want to show you a couple of clips of progressive members of Congress absolutely grilling oil executives. This was good to see. It's just kind of satisfying to watch this shit, you know. So we're going to start with Rashida Tlaib, and then we will watch Cori Bush second. I wanted to show you guys the full clip here. So this is the full 5 minutes. There are a couple of, particularly tantalizing bits in here. So this is Rashida Tlaib grilling some oil executives this previous week. Enjoy.
Mr. Woods, did Exxon help fund One Alaska? Yes or no?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, One Alaska was a front group created specifically to oppose Alaska's ballot initiative that would require oil companies to pay their fair share. It actually received nearly $21 million in contributions. 94% of One Alaska's contributions came from 5 oil and gas companies, including Exxon and BP. So I would like to submit for the record, Madam Chair, an article, Oil Companies Spend Big to Try to Defeat Alaska's Tax Proposal.
Without objection.
Same thing in Colorado in 2018, where a measure, this is resident-led measure, ballot measure, to ban oil and gas extraction within a half a mile of homes, schools, and waterways on the ballot. That front group was called Colorado Rising. And that one, and again, resident-led, that one, Mr. Mike Wirth, I'm not even going to bother to ask if you're familiar with, because I know the answer. Many of you, all of you, helped fund some of these. I guess Chevron specifically funded $33 million behind its subsidiary, Noble Energy, contributed to that front group. Mr. Summers, are you familiar with Energy Citizens?
I am familiar with Energy Citizens, Congresswoman.
I'm glad you are. It's a front group to American Petroleum Institute, uses it to flood Facebook with hundreds of ads opposing climate provisions in the Build Back Better Act. There, you all spent about, nearly $500,000 in misleading ads since August. Of course, when you look at these ads, y'all, the public, when you look at these ads, they don't say the name Exxon, BP, Chevron anywhere. Y'all hide and you deceive the public. So oil and gas companies can go claiming that they are pro-environment while opposing sensible pro-environment measures in secret. Lies, plain and simple. Madam Chair, in Michigan, and I'd like to submit for the record as well, Michigan utilities front groups begin misleading and campaigns ahead of a vote on energy legislation for the record.
Without objection.
There, DTE Energy and Consumers Energy used a front group called Alliance for Michigan Power and Citizens for Energizing Michigan's Economy, respectively, to target my residents and their amazing work. They're the ones fundraising for this, Madam Chair, to support increased rooftop solar energy. That's how they wanted to cut the energy cost so they can make a living, so they can provide a quality life for their families by reducing their reliance on corporate polluters. Mike Wirth, when are you going to cut the check?
Congresswoman, I'm not trying to understand the context of your question.
That's okay. Okay, so
could I, excuse me, I'd like to correct something that you've
sure.
been provided with some inaccurate information. Noble Energy was not a subsidiary of Chevron in 2000.
Okay, you can submit it for the record, sir. So Chevron, you can submit it to the committee. Chevron has about 70 serious cases of environmental and community abuses in 31 countries worldwide, owing over $50 billion in judgments and settlements checks, literally settlement debts that you all have. So Mike, when are you going to cut the check?
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with the number you
When are you going to cut the $50 billion check that you owe? It went through the courts. You owe $50 billion to communities in 31 countries.
Congresswoman, I'd be happy to take a look at the source for your information on
Sure.
this and get back to you on it, because I have no understanding of what.
Well, I have a message for you as Chevron CEO. I mean, you made what, $29 million last year in poisoning the planet? Mr. Wirth, you can't arrest us all. You can't arrest the truth. Do you understand what I'm trying to say to you?
Congresswoman, I am not exactly following.
So you're targeting and actions against the human rights lawyer Donziger. I mean, what you did there, your company, maybe through subsidiaries, I don't know. I just want to remind you, there are more of us than there are of you. You can poison the planet to make money, but we're going to defend the planet so we can live. and we will win. So, I need Chevron to cut the check. You owe $50 billion to indigenous communities and people that you harmed for profit. This is not about vilifying these companies. This is about accountability. You all know we're all paying the cost, from our public health to our environment, the actions that you take, and you're hiding behind subsidiaries, and it's wrong. These are residents putting ballot initiatives on their local ballot to make a difference to save our planet. Get out of the way so they can do the work for the people in the community they live in. Thank you, and I yield.
Rashida pretty well seared him there. And do you guys notice how they just play fucking dumb? We covered this too with the big tech jackasses last week. Zuckerberg and, they just play dumb. Bezos was one of them. I'm not familiar with what you referenced. I would need to see a source on that. I don't know jack shit about the company that I run, so I can't answer any of these questions. It's all just, their lawyers tell them don't answer anything that you don't have, that you aren't asked explicitly. Any way you can dance around a question or say, I don't know, it's pathetic. But that is the strategy they take. So again, I said Cori Bush. That is the next clip that we're going to watch here. Same hearing, grilling the same assholes. By the way, huge shout out to Rashida Tlaib for mentioning Donziger and calling Chevron out for their conduct as it pertains to Steven Donziger. This is Cori Bush also grilling those fossil fuel executives.
In large part to those testifying today and the corporations they represent, St. Louis has 11 more 90-degree days per year than when I was born. Mr. Lawler, are the overwhelming majority of fossil fuel CEOs Black or white?
I don't have the exact numbers, but I would assume they're white.
Yes. Ms. Watkins, is an oil refinery more likely to be situated in a Black community or a white community?
I'm not sure how to answer that, honestly. We've got oil refineries along the U.S. Gulf Coast, and we're very proud to be community members there.
It's Black. Yeah, it's Black. Mr. Wirt, are the impacts of climate change more likely to hit a Black neighborhood or a white neighborhood first?
Congresswoman, I have not seen studies that would allow me to give you
The answer is Black. The facts are clear. A 2017 NAACP and Clean Air Task Force report found that Black Americans are 75% more likely to live next to company, industrial, and service facilities that directly harm us. For years, you all have continued to promote fossil fuels despite knowing that promoting them means promoting environmental racism and violence in Black and brown communities. You all are still promoting and selling fossil fuels that are killing millions of people. This is a striking example of white supremacy. Your profit-driven choices threaten my life, the lives of my family, my neighbors, and our communities every single day. I sit before you as a Black congresswoman with asthma caused by fossil fuels and the tear gas you fund. I have a lot of questions, let me say. Mr. Woods, as CEO, are you responsible for what Exxon does? Yes or no? It's just a yes or no.
For what ExxonMobil does, yes, I am.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. It's not a coincidence that toxic waste is frequently dumped in Black communities like mine. When toxic waste combines with fossil fuel flooding, the impact is unspeakable. My old basement in St. Louis County in a predominantly Black neighborhood used to regularly fill with potentially radioactive waste next to my son's bedroom due to floods made more frequent and intense by your production and burning of fossil fuels. Public school playgrounds in St. Louis regularly flood with radioactive water. Mr. Woods, would you send your children to one of these schools? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Would you send your children to one of the schools where radioactive waste, where we have this flooding? Thank you.
I would not.
Thank you. And I don't want to either, neither does my community. It's not a coincidence that our communities are more likely to flood. You have known this flooding was coming for years. Ms. Watkins has too. Ms. Watkins, in the 1988 Shell report on page 26, it says large low-lying areas like Bangladesh may need to be abandoned. Ms. Watkins, does that bother you that your company deemed a country of 98 million brown people expendable in exchange for storing profits? Yes or no? It's just a yes or no.
Actually, Congresswoman, I'm glad my company's been involved in the science research and involved in these discussions for decades. And we have been open and engaging with communities. And I feel what you're saying. And we are very active in the communities in which we operate and looking to make ourselves very much members of the community and invest in communities, especially where there is risk of climate change hitting harder than in other places.
Thank you very much, because it bothers me. Let me just say that. You didn't say it, but I'll say it. It bothers me.
It bothers me too.
What
bothers me is that
that's the end of my questions. I have to keep moving. But I have another question for you. Was Shell aware that Black and Indigenous communities in the U.S. would flood and burn first? Yes or no? Black and Indigenous communities.
I'm sorry, Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with what you're referencing.
Let me ask you this. Are Black communities like mine in St. Louis expendable to you?
Of course not. Communities are not expendable. We work every day hand in hand with our communities. And in fact, climate change is such a pressing issue that we have, as companies, we have to work with the communities and with societies and with the government if we're going to be able to get to net zero by 2050.
Thank you. And, you know, your companies for decades have been misrepresenting information and redirecting attention to solutions you know to be false. And that's continuing even in this hearing. But I thank you for speaking up and saying what you said. We appreciate that. But we're at a tipping point. Developing fossil fuels now, given the escalation of the climate crisis and its harm on Black and brown communities, is unconscionable. Given each of your roles in these attacks on our humanity, you all should resign. Thank you, and I yield back.
Don't you just love that? She's polite and shit, and when they actually acknowledge their harm in some rare moment, she'll say thank you for that answer, and she's all nice to him, and then at the end she says, I think you all should resign. I love it. I love it. And again, executives just play dumb the whole time. They know the answers, but they try their best not to give them. The one woman says she's proud. Proud of what? Proud of covering up evidence of the climate crisis? Proud of covering up your role in it? Is that what you're proud of? Proud of polluting schools? Proud of polluting marginalized communities? Poisoning children? That's what you're proud of? You know, she just, actually, I'm proud that we were part of it. It's insane to me. Insane. But they try to twist it, contort the message into something that can be perceived as them being responsible and not them being monsters. So again, you know, I criticize politicians all the time when I don't think they're doing enough, and I wanted to praise Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush there for absolutely searing a bunch of fossil fuel executives, and in a way that like we just don't often see in Congress, you guys. That usually hardball is like half of that. You know, it's good to see that. And I think we need, as a society more broadly, we need to make sure that that's the message we're pushing when we talk about these issues, is that the capitalistic incentive structure there is what drives that harm, right? One thing, just a quick side note, one thing that very much bothers me about environmental discussion is when we make it about individuals, right? Now, I'm please don't get me wrong, all for individuals doing whatever you can to, you know, minimize your footprint, all for it. But if you sit here and say the climate crisis is because you drive a car, 75% of pollution is done by 100 companies. So the problem is not individuals who are participating in the society that we've built, right? The person who needs to drive to get to work to put food on the table is not the problem. The problem is the companies that engage in this massive pollution and this system of prioritizing profit over everything else, even a habitable environment, right? And it's just good to see those executives who have been the benefactors of this corrupt system and capitalistic system at least get grilled every now and again, right? If you're going to make your fucking $20 million in bonuses or whatever, at least you got to sit in front of Congress and get grilled a little bit, right? We got to take what we can get, right, you guys? It's pathetic that it's that little, but we got to take what we can get. And good on Rashida Tlaib and good on Cori Bush for taking them to task in the manner that they did. So at this point, I would like to bring in my guest. We have him back. Kennedy Carter is here today. Thank you so much for taking the time, Kennedy.
Hi. Can you hear and see me well?
I can hear and yep. You're a little dark, but I can hear you pretty good. So
yeah, I've heard that before.
So
let's see. Let's get you. I want y'all to see me.
There you go.
Let's get this light on me. Yeah, there we go.
There we go. See a little bit there. Yep. All right, so I wanted to start by you're working on some stuff for us on the social media side. Kennedy, for those viewers that don't know, is with Real Progressives. Can you talk a little bit about what we're doing with some of these expanding what platforms we're on and where people can get involved if they're interested?
Heck yeah, absolutely. Actually, it would actually be even easier for you guests if I have the ability to share my screen as I continue to relay some of that. Is that an ability that I have?
Try to set it up so you can do that. I'm not.
Well, I see the ability here to share, so maybe it's just something you have to request. So if I hit share screen here, do you see something that pops up that says, let me do it? You should see it maybe now.
Oh, yep. Add to stream. There we go.
Sick. Okay, so just give me a minute here as I pull up my resources. And so what I would like to focus on, to give a little background here, it's a little hot too. Real Progressives is a real opportunity, I think, for leftists with the MMT informed lens to be able to bring a lot of people together in YouTube, not necessarily even people that are MMT oriented, because a lot of YouTube, if you follow people like, if you've ever heard of Destiny or Vosh, these people that are, just streaming for hours and they're gaming and they're doing reaction videos on political news or they're debating people, like that's a real opportunity for MMT people. As someone who's watched a lot of hours of that and is pursuing a degree in economics, like I think it'd be really, really helpful to have someone denature some of that with an MMT lens, just because, when you go home and you just want to game or whatever, and these people are like split screen, some of those ideas still get in their head. So if they were doing that to people in the Real Progressives organization, I hope to start maybe a consortium of people who are able to do this thing where they're gaming, playing chess, League, Dragon Ball Z, Star Wars, whatever it is, and be able to have people come home, relax, chill, pull up our streams, be in our Discord, chat with us while we're getting our business done. And I'm more than willing to be able to have a lot of these debates, because MMT, I think, changes the left-right debate a lot and changes a lot of the zero-sum thinking. I mean, with what you were talking about earlier, and Rashida Tlaib, these politicians who are gerrymandered and not to having more representation, like there's a real opportunity to get people being like, oh shit, we don't have to hurt each other for us to get here. And a lot of YouTube leftism is about that. Well, we're eventually going to have to kill the Nazis. We're eventually going to have to do like hurtful things to each other because there's no other way. There's only the zero-sum option. And I don't want to make people feel dumb. I come from a conservative background myself. And so knowing and not being one myself and feeling grace still with the culture I grew up in, it's easy for me to not make people feel like, because of the information they didn't know, and I didn't know until recently, that they're not stupid. So before I end that, you can continue as I pull up the stream, because I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Perfect. Yeah. No, I think that's a really profound point, Kennedy. And I think people immediately shut down when they're told you don't understand, you're stupid, so if that's even implied, even if it's really not meant, if that's even implied, you've just shut somebody down from hearing what you're trying to say. And the other point I want to make is at one point I was pretty much a partisan Democrat, and I didn't know MMT until I was taught it, right? So you can't hold people's ignorance against them. If they haven't been exposed to this stuff, they haven't been exposed to it. So I do think that's an important mentality to keep in mind for the viewers too, when they're potentially out talking MMT with people, is this person might not know at all what you're talking about. So don't slam them like it, anyhow. Yeah. If you had any thoughts on that.
No, I couldn't have said it any better. I'm really just here to listen to you, because I'm really I feel like what you do is a part of the consortium that I'm trying to create. Like there needs to be people out here reviewing this stuff and talking about it from an MMT lens and letting people know that these are our options here. So I'm just here to have you talk to me about whatever you need to, and rift as long as we need to.
Well, I appreciate
pull this up.
part of the coalition. Yeah, if you want to pull up the social media stuff. And yeah, it's, I think it's important to put this stuff in some different contexts too, where people, I think sometimes people, they're in modes of like, I'm gonna do something fun and I'm gonna let my brain relax for a little bit. And if you can catch them in that mode and actually slip some information in a way that's not like, I'm gonna lecture you, or I'm gonna, I think there's an avenue there to maybe reach some people that otherwise might not be as inclined to come find content like this.
Ooh, well said. Actually, I'm going to send this to you because I'm on an old laptop as I'm working from
no problem
home.
Yeah,
I'll
try to bring it up.
Yeah. I mean, I used to have a really, really nice laptop that we created an all VPN source on. So I'm unable to do what I usually was able to do. But I'm sending you this link now, and you can go ahead and share your screen. And then Perfect. I'll go ahead and describe it. And this will be a really, really good example, I think.
And briefly for the viewers, bottom of the screen there, Kennedy's Twitter handle. If you don't follow him, make sure you do so. He's always got some outside the box views on things and a great way of looking at economics. We're going to get a little bit later into some of that stuff too after the social media.
Oh yeah. All right. Yeah. You're getting this link now. So go ahead and share that when you're ready.
Will do.
And you can just go to any moment in the video, probably mid, so that you get a full view of what's going on.
Let me make sure I'm sharing with volume here.
Here, I'm going to add more light too for you.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm having trouble bringing this up. Let's try one more time.
Okay. If you pull it up. Okay, yeah. Let's go ahead and skip to some of that. Maybe the mid portion of it.
It keeps dying on me. I don't think I can share this. It just keeps going away. I'll try one more time. Sorry to the viewers for the technical difficulties.
Happens to the best of us.
See if it'll do it this time. No. Where'd you go? There you went. Okay.
Yeah. So can your viewers hear some of the commentary?
Yep.
Okay. So what's happening here, what I think is lovely. So Vosh started in 2019. Dude makes, $280K. But what's beautiful about this opportunity is because a lot of people are gaming, in their free time. An opportunity like this, if he's watching a debate where Charlie Kirk is debating someone about abortion, and so he goes through the whole debate, while he's gaming with people in the Discord chat on what looked like, I think was Diablo 3. And so what this gives me the opportunity to do is for me as a gamer in my pastime, to be able to bring a lot of these people in on those notes, for gaming and for conversations to chill. And then they have me in the background getting this information. And that's sort of what he was able to do. I mean, you saw hundreds of thousands of views for that one. And when you do that for hours, I mean, that just works with the algorithm and is able to help us progress the more we have people doing that. I think what's so unique about doing this. Oh, continue.
I just wanted to confirm this is Twitch. Is that correct?
Yeah. So he's streaming on Twitch or his own website. I don't know because he was banned from Twitch recently. So he may be streaming from his own website.
But RP's going to be doing this through Twitch.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing it through Twitch and also through Discord and allowing people to either stream. If it's in a serious debate or conversation like this, someone else can be showing off. And I'm also a Smash player. So the opportunity to get some of these conversations in with these, maybe even right wingers, and have conversations with people while we play Smash is, I think, a really, really beautiful opportunity. Because I mean, the best conversations happen during Smash.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for the viewers, make sure you check out Real Progressives on Discord and Twitch if you're interested in getting involved with this stuff. And I think it's a fantastic medium. Is this gonna? I guess, can you just explain a little bit? I just have not been on Twitch. So how as a social media, how is it built in terms of social media? Is there an easy way to reach audiences?
So what I think is so interesting, especially because I was a Discord person before I got into a lot of this. You know, my buddies from high school and college, like after 6 p.m. after they get off work, I can see them hop on Discord, and they're playing games like Valorant, they're playing games like Smash, what have you, chess, even board games, and so you're able to just have, if you want some of that parasocial connection, they just jump in a little bit after work, and so sharing through the algorithms is really nice, because when people, if they want to have super chats and they want to be able to communicate or have a moment where they get to say something or have a moment where they get to stream something, maybe they'll submit $5, submit $2. And if you're doing that over 3 hours, that's a really good way to build community, but also to monetize and help build your organization through the work that you're doing. And I think that's what's going to be a necessity, because these YouTube, I mean, Destiny, if you've heard of him, he's a millionaire or close to it, if not more. So like that ability to talk to people on that level and not have it be so focused on MMT is also going to drive our algorithms in a different way, because then people are going to be looking up streams for their, regular gaming situations, and then they're just going to happen to stumble upon the commentary. And I think that's the key right there, is getting people to just stumble upon it and not feel it like that's what they have to do in the background. And then we're just going to have more people doing that.
It takes it out of that like economic silo, because some people just as soon as you kind of like make them feel like you're in this academic space, they kind of not interested, or that's too much. It's it doesn't feel fun. It feels like you're having to do homework or something. And so yeah, I think that's all absolutely fantastic. I think reaching people with MMT in any way that we possibly can is fantastic, and reaching out to audiences that otherwise might not engage is all the better. And I really like the attitude of like, let's talk to anybody. You know what I mean? It's not that everybody's our ally, or that it's let's talk to everybody. Like, let's, you know what I mean? I really appreciate that attitude in general.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about like how we view work and employment, right?
Ooh.
And I covered a story last week that I wanted to get your thoughts on, and it's all of the things happening with college athletes. It seems rather arbitrary and ridiculous to me that we've always considered them not to be workers because they're students, right? The comparison I made last week was, if LeBron James took an online class, is he no longer able to make his money because he's now a student athlete? Like, it seems so arbitrary and ridiculous to me that we do this. So now, fortunately, there is a players union forming for college football players. It's going to take years to implement, and they're also courts have now allowed college players in certain circumstances to take sponsorships, so they can at least make some money on their likeness as athletes. So I'm just curious what your thought is on kind of how we view workers in this way, and how we're progressing on those issues.
I mean, I really appreciate it. That's quite a hardball question for me, because sports are not a thing for me. I come from non-team sports, swimming and boxing. So my love for sports has never been huge, especially with American football being just little car accidents as a sport. I feel like there's a reason other countries haven't picked them up. So when it comes to jobs, and I mean, the only sports thing I've ever watched is Ted Lasso recently. So when it comes to sports, I definitely feel like, considering I went to Xavier, which was a huge basketball school, and knowing that I went to that school because it is known for its healthcare institutions and the opportunities that provides for people. I was able to have a wonderful education that I don't regret, but knowing that more of the money was funneling towards the basketball program, because that's kind of what Xavier is also known for, was something I thought about heavily, because if those were just federal student workers, or if they were just paid, as a part of the program, I think it would be very, very different. But I think because, if you really want to get in the weeds of it, because sports in America is also institutionalized as like this way for investors to have their stadiums and their little sports institutions in the center of cities, as opposed to maybe a train stop. Like the way that sports is able to convene public area, and the way people, do with their weekend times. What are people doing right now? Probably watching some type of Sunday sport, and specifically right here. So I think when it comes to sports and the way that people are scouted, I hear a lot that there are not a lot of African Americans in certain sports, but when you think about our culture and what sports are marketed to us,
right,
you get into a whole different conversation. So I'm all for paying the hell out of anyone doing any type of athletic, I mean, work in general, if you're spending your time doing something, and that's what's beauty about MMT, you need to be paid for it, and you need to be paid livably. And arguably, we're going to be better off if you do. Like these student athletes should be able to not focus so much on sports being their life, because I mean, they're going to hit 50 and be really struggling really soon. So like that's, it's not
well,
really...
and in football, like 50 struggling with a bunch of brain damage and like altered mentally, you know, like I can't even, and you know, my thing is, like, I think it's absurd in many ways how much weight we put on sports, and to your point about the stadiums, and like, you know, when the top athletes make 30 million a year and paramedics make nothing, and like there's all sorts we could, you know what I mean? But in the case of college football, what drives me so ballistic about it is it's like a $10 billion industry, and all that money is going to TV executives and the people running the universities, and you know what I mean? Instead of the people who are actually destroying their bodies for the entertainment, you know, so I think it kind of presents an interesting look at how we actually view employment and work.
Right. As if the CEOs aren't, people aren't going to still watch football and basketball if the CEOs make 20 times less than they do.
It's that specific guy at TNT that makes you want to watch, you know, like no, it's the people on the so to kind of pivot to another, like, I think right now we're seeing people's attitudes towards their work shifting drastically. I think a lot of it has to do with the pandemic and just kind of having a perspective shift. I think a lot of people were maybe concerned they were going to lose their life to COVID, or concerned they were going to lose a loved one, or God forbid even did lose a loved one to COVID. And I think that really alters your perspective on your life and how you want to spend your time, and how, you know, what work means to you and to your community. Can you just speak a little bit to that attitude shift and what you're seeing in terms of people's perception of their work and their role in society?
Oh man, well, that's a partially personal question, because I actually discovered economics as a result of this pandemic. To lay my cards on the table, I had been a volunteer for Elizabeth Warren not getting what I wanted out of the policies and the prescriptions for her and Bernie Sanders. So I wanted to know the minds behind them, and learning about Stephanie Kelton and Gabriel Zuckman and all the economists behind them, where the policies were being written. That's where I got this jump. And then it happened that within the months of me discovering that, the pandemic started, and I've lost people, quite a few people in my life that should be still here had it not been for COVID. But one of the things that keeps me going, and somehow crazily I still find hope in, is at this moment when we all got those stimulus checks, when we all billions of us did this thing that humanity's never done before, to try and manage a disease together. I think it really served as an opportunity to view our interdependence and that foundation that MMT offers, that money is this tool of law. So what we write as law, what we write together, what we decide is interchangeable, is what money is. It's not something that exists in the ground, and that changes everything. And I've been able to find hope in knowing that the more people, I think, feel that in their hearts, know it, imagine it, and dream it, the more we can tell the stories about ourselves and change the systems that we need to do. Because I'm also a huge proponent of human nature and anthropology arguments, because I also believe if you understand how money works, if you think that human beings are naturally brutally selfish assholes, you're not gonna provision MMT in a way that's accurate either. You're gonna still do harmful stuff. So I think we have to design stories about ourselves that are more empathetic and compassionate to see that and trust it. And that's part of the interdependence, because the scarcity that we build is all manufactured.
Yeah. I think that's a really fantastic point. Can you speak a little bit to everyone that I've talked to that gets MMT it's like it changes their politics in certain ways. How did it change the way that you viewed the world when it all kind of clicked?
Yeah, that's funny you asked that too, because I also read in the middle of that, there was also the book called Ezra Klein, Why We're Polarized. And so I was very, very, very focused before economics on the incentives of political institutions, because I truly, before I got into that and the human nature stuff, believed that people aren't just evil. People are doing the things that they're doing in their job that the job lets them do. And so, for example, learning banks are just public utilities was like that for me. Of course, of course, the National Bank, and knowing that the history of banks from a book called The Color of Money, and I mean, everyone's seen Hamilton at this point. We attempted to have a national bank and we didn't. And then the slave states had their own banks that African Americans couldn't get their dollar in. And then when we created the dollar, we now had a currency that was equal value for white and black people. So that kind of history and feeling that, learning it has just made the way I view politics so different. It's also made me see, as someone that lives in Ohio, Michigan, like two of the most gerrymandered states in the country, like the opportunity for us to just change those. Like if we changed gerrymandering and filibustering, we have, this is like a whole weedsy thing for me, but like we have no concept for the last 20 years what it would have been like if Democrats had 20% less people to focus on. They could say fuck you to the Joe Manchin. Excuse me if I'm not allowed to say that. I apologize.
Oh no, please say fuck you to Joe Manchin, please.
Okay. Well, they wouldn't have really needed Joe Manchin in their party to capitulate to, and Republicans would have needed not only the Joe Manchins, but they would have needed a few of us to be able to win. And that we have no idea what that alternative history would have looked like. But I think if we do that, we change those policies immediately and then push MMT as hard as we can, we're walking into an alternative, like a future that I think a lot of hope is not really focused on, but I'm really focused on. So that's how it's sort of changed my politics, is that I don't think I'll live to see all of the beauty of what's going to happen, but I'm really excited for what people like you and me are going to do to set the stage.
Yeah, I do find a little bit of hope in seeing, I mean, even just a year or two ago, so many fewer people were talking about this stuff. It has in some senses penetrated the mainstream and you know, at least portions of it. Seeing Yarmouth, like acknowledging this stuff has been huge for me, where it's like, oh my God, a budget chair that's like, you know, it's cool to see that kind of stuff. It's, you know, and yeah, I also think, you know, this kind of actually pairs with another big discussion that's happening right now that kind of turned into a culture war, in my view, unnecessarily. And that's like the critical legal theory, critical race theory stuff, right? Like, how do you actually perceive the institutions in your society? And do you acknowledge that certain forms of oppression are just cooked into them, that they were built to maintain the status quo for those who are currently enjoying the status quo, right? It seems illogical for the powerful to make institutions that would be to their detriment. And that's kind of all that we're talking about. And money, when you take this exogenous view on, not to get too wonky, but when you think money comes from authorities and not as some natural organic formation of markets, you know, as MMT acknowledges it does, it's always been part of the authorities. You really do change how you view monetary policy and fiscal policy. It's like, oh, so you're just choosing to let people suffer. It's not like you're just mad at your job. You're just like, fuck those people. You know what I mean? It totally shifts your mindset.
What's funny about what you just said too is that it, in some ways, it makes it this, and I don't know how much of a hot take this is, but in some ways, it makes it easier for me to sometimes talk with libertarianish people versus like very hardcore left people, because I think when you take the idea seriously, like when my mother was in one of the rooms for the Stop the Steal vote, you know, like in Wayne County, just counting our votes, and so just watching what could have been like the loss of someone in my life from a conspiracy theory that was just made up on the spot, just watched it be created, but also taking seriously that that's the only information you're getting. And if you accept that zero-sum thing that like, well, when you have more immigrants and more progressive votes, your country is going to be denatured like all of these other countries. I'm able to like, there's something in me from coming from conservative backgrounds in Detroit, but also feeling grace where that comes from and not agreeing with it, to be able to understand it deeply. And knowing that those ideas are like just a little, I think what's key to it is that when people feel like they've been fooled, they're much more salient to changing their mind than if you have to open up your emotional vulnerability to the idea that maybe the way you orient your life or the way you orient community needs to be adjusted. Or maybe there are toxic, unhealthy habits that you have in your own life that then extend to the way that you do politics. And I've found that like when people assume that things were made this way, but then they've been fooled, if people are open to expand, that's that whole like sociology, like openness to experience versus closeness thing that people have, empathy and versus compassion. How people lie on that spectrum has nothing to do with left or right. And so I've found that like when people get denatured and realizing that they're being fooled, especially if they're libertarian, they're like, well, wait, so they could come in the legal way, and so they're just doing this on purpose. Like, it makes a lot of sense, especially because a lot of right wingers are spending time telling us that like there's an enemy out there, but if the enemy is viewed as like a minority community, like it just changes so many things. And I've had more conversations with ease with that versus people that are like, well, I've experienced this trauma from the white race as like a person of minority, and I feel like I deserve my own ethno state. And that's a more difficult route to take because there are emotions behind that.
Yeah, that definitely is going to create a more explosive debate or argument, or however you want to put it. I think it's very profound to say people are more willing to accept that they've been lied to than like something about how you are processing it is wrong, right? Because then it's a personal attack. Then it's like you don't understand because something about you is not capable of understanding, as opposed to all these powerful people have lied to you, and that like they've lied to everybody, and it makes it not a personal attack. I think that's an important way to approach it. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to all this gaming stuff, Kennedy, because I think you have a really good attitude towards engaging people on all of these kinds of issues. I am curious to get your thoughts on. I feel like I've talked about this ad nauseum, but it is what's going on right now is the reconciliation bill, and how you view the repeat it effectively of the Obama administration, where a lot of promises are made during the campaign, and then they're not met, and then come midterms, the Democrats are going to be upset that they lost, and like what happened, and the rotating villain with Manchin and Sinema. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but I'll kind of give you the floor. What do you think about all of this that's been going on, and all the things that have been gutted from the bill, and how do you see it proceeding?
Thank you for asking that. Okay, so know that my answer is of two minds, and with everything in our political system as a Westerner, I have to view things with two minds because the incentives aren't, I don't think, structured in a way for me to not have that dual space. So on the one hand, you have the fact that like Joe Biden and the administration knows this information. Like if you like the mint the coin drama, like knowing that they know the public, they have an opinion that the public shouldn't understand how money works and that we have to keep up this game for a little bit is a very, very dark and almost more insidious thing than I think a lot of Republicans can do, because I think Republicans are operating in a more theological moral space. If we're being really honest, they're arguing from a more, and considering the things that they focus on, abortion, trans rights, these things that are about sociological discussions, that's what they're focused on making their game. But for Democrats to make that argument, that's about human nature. You're saying something about humans' intrinsic ability not to be able to understand information and make good decisions on it. So part of me about that boils my blood. And I haven't, I'm very upset with the opportunity that they have at their hand, but knowing that they're not doing anything about it. Now, here's the second mind. And this is coming from the incentives focus and someone who can imagine being in that room, being in that seat, is that because Democrats are intrinsically in our system since 1964, when I got the right to vote, like they need 65% to win. And so when you're always thinking in your head about your incentives and the fact that you need at least 10 to 15% of people who are very right wing and have these theological moral foundations that they don't agree with, you need them to vote for you too. That changes the incentives of what you think you're able to do if you want to be successful. Like, because our role here as media figures and people like reaching out in community is to just spread the word. But when you're in that role, you have the public service role attached to that work. And so because Democrats, Joe Manchin shouldn't exist. Manchin exists because the Senate orients rural votes in a way that Republicans don't need to compete for the cities that they manage. And so, I saw something the other week about him considering switching another party. And I'm just like, it also takes a little bit of history to look at the Whigs and other parties that have been in similar situations. And I feel like Democrats, January is going to reach a certain point. I reached out to Tim Ryan about the job guarantee. And one of the things that was discussed to me and makes it difficult to argue about public policies that the filibuster won't matter. They won't care. They'll send an email and then it won't go to the floor, so it doesn't matter because of Joe Manchin. And so what I want to focus on is getting everyone carrying the hell out of gerrymandering and the filibuster and remove those pieces that let them cheat. Because what that would do is just change our politics intrinsically in the way that they're oriented now and just be a little bit easier like other countries have. And so that's just the main point about I understand my blood boils about the decisions that they're making, but I also understand like there's a Senate rate right now. It's 49-50 Democrats. And in January, I mean, student debt has been in this limbo for almost 2 years now. I fully suspect in the next 2 months, if Tim Ryan wins that election and they're able to get 52-48, they're going to do something they're going to try to do stuff. But I don't like that strategy. You know, even if that is their like progressive long-term strategy, I still disagree and hate with it because you're not letting people know that like, hey, the reason we're not passing shit is because of these fucking people that won't let us, and we need to have these little stupid rules disappear. Like if they need to put money into caring about that, and they don't, and that boils the hell out of my blood. So it makes me more mad.
So for the next stage, supposing we get there, the next like problem that I might present is I do think there are quite a few Democrats who are all too happy to not have to be the mansion or cinema that's the public facing, I don't want to pass this, but that do take a lot of big donations and are all too happy to kind of hide behind that rotating villain. You know what I mean? So how do you does that in your mind come down to kind of just the rank corruption that both parties engage in, or at least that a lot of members of both parties engage in? Or how do you get at that incentive structure, even if we were to get past the filibuster, the voting rights? I mean, if I had my way, we'd abolish the Senate, but you know, at least get rid of the archaic rules and things. How do we proceed once we actually get to the point that there's less of an issue partisan wise, and it really does become, how do we get this party to represent us in the ways that we want it to?
That is a beautiful question. You asked a better question like media figures asked, the popular media figures, but that kind of stuff.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
hey, if I can't be Jake Tapper, what am I doing up here, right?
Great question. So my answer to that is that the incentives. So I'm able to. I'm a very imaginative person, as my therapist has relayed to me back in the past. And so it's very, very easy for me to get into the space of like what the incentive structures could be. And my bachelor's in healthcare, like I was taught to understand you're in a village. I mean, and people are illiterate, but you need to build a healthcare system that matches Cradle, like Cincinnati, go. Like, so understanding the systematic approach from the ground up is something I like think about thoroughly. And so if I imagine a filibuster change, what that would do to Republicans, because they're still going to need to win unless they want to end up like the Whigs. And then you already have looked into politicians that are fiending on this. So Marco Rubio, for example, reached out to Stephanie Kelton. So Marco Rubio knows MMT. And what's going to happen in the next 10 years when trans activism and like economic inequality becomes less difficult to argue about, and we get more into like labor policy, Marco Rubio is going to be right there for it. He's aware of it, and he's going to know how to capitulate and change his rhetoric in order to like be safe in that space. But that also means you're gonna have people that kind of want to vote for, you know what I mean? Like if he's going to be arguing for things that like we actually agree with, that's going to change our incentive structure too, because it's not happening. We don't have, for progressive people, another side where anyone's offering anything that's relative to like our vision of the future, or like a collective vision of the future for any community that's existed. Because it's a very, what's happening is a very right-wing theological moral argument that they're producing that's supported by this capitalist idea that MMT is trying to denature. So to answer your question finally, I think you would see what would happen is you'd have a lot more progressive Democrats, just straight up. You'd have a lot more people that live in big cities able to run and be as progressive as they want. And you'd also have a lot of right-wing people that are able to be more left and to present maybe more libertarian ideas, but they're going to shift the party in an orientation that, I mean, for the same reason that the slave power no longer exists, or the certain powers don't longer exist, they're just going to disappear. And it doesn't, a lot of people think that it has to go away with time, and basically people dying. And I'm not about that. Like, I think people are of all ages are able to change their minds. That's why we were in love with these very old politicians. So I think people have when the filibuster is released, that's like the floodgates for MMT's opportunity. Because then if everyone knows that like, oh wait, we have majority rule for stuff now, and we can also talk about money being this thing that's intrinsically tied to our new majoritarian politics. Who knows?
Yeah. I appreciate the optimism there. That gives me a little glimpse of hope in terms of electoral politics actually serving something in a way that they haven't in quite some time, at least through the neoliberal era. Yeah, I'm also curious to get your thoughts on, you mentioned kind of as we progress to, as certain like cultural hot button issues right now, they all tend to calm down, right, as the debates happen and one side kind of takes over, and then it becomes easier to make these arguments, and a majority comes to consensus, and then you move on to perhaps the more labor side of things. And I'm curious how you look at as as we continue to automate things more, and as the economy moves in the direction it's going, what kind of jobs, like maybe out of the box service sector jobs, things like this, like you mentioned something about video games last time that you were on the show, about how jobs could be created in that field. Can you just talk about some of the out of the box opportunities that might present themselves?
Oh my God, yes. I love talking about the change in value for work that MMT opportunities, especially since I focused a lot on anthropology and the way that we used to do work for the 300,000 years that we lived before we started farming. So that, I mean, and that's part of the human nature stuff, because a lot of what we assume in society comes from like, oh, well, we start with Mesopotamia and the Greeks and the Egyptians, but we lived for 280,000 years before that. In the same way that we live now, without the scarcity for food, without diseases. So we should be focused on that lifestyle as a way to orient ourselves, not like how to expand on what Egypt was doing, So with work being defined differently, like what's an example that I love? Like when it comes to video games, like if you're a person that loves chess, chess is very, very mind stimulating. So someone that isn't able to walk has the opportunity to be paid a livable wage to just sit and talk and communicate with someone who maybe doesn't have, a support system anymore, or is in hospice, and their family doesn't have the time to like give that to them. They could be paid, to sit there and play with them, give them that time. But that's not really a private institution is not going to pay someone $22 an hour to sit and do that. But we can, and that the idea that wouldn't be beneficial to both of them is ridiculous. So and when you brought up automation, because I actually just watched Dune. And so the idea of like the spectrums of what we will do with machinery, like there's the Dune alternative of just fully analog, no robots, or the Star Wars universe where robots exist as our like basically our slaves. I didn't want to say that, but like I didn't know another way else to put that. But they exist as an extension of us. And a lot of the art depictions about AI and automation being these things that take away people, a lot of that comes from very cynical Hobbesian views of the future. And women getting into computer science now have changed a lot of this. And this is gonna mess you up a little bit. But what's likely going to happen with machines is that we're gonna, when you update a software, no one thinks about this that it's killing something. But once machines start to get recognized and just be an extension of our software that can constantly be changed, because the idea that machines can't just be written code differently makes no sense, because they're just extensions of us. So once they start to get recognized sentiently, we're not gonna know how much they were suffering before we recognize their suffering, kind of thing. And that really, really messes with me, because in Star Wars, it's not like they don't have stuff to do. I mean, and part of my article goes into the cynicism of Star Wars itself and in the scarcity that they present, even though everyone's still having jobs. So I really have hope that it doesn't have to be written in our future that machines take over. Machines should be making it easier for us to do fun stuff with our work. That's how we should be viewing it. Like, I don't want to do this stuff. Machine takes care of it. And then maybe when it's sentient, we have it, get respect or something. But they'll always just be extensions of us. So they should just be ways that we value each other and go back and hone back to our freestyle of life. Not like, well, they're taking away our jobs. There's nothing to do now.
Yeah. I like to say it's the problem with automation is not that there's less to do. The problem with automation is that all of that benefit is going to a very particular small group of people, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of that machine taking hours away from workers and saying to the workers, hey, so I guess you're only working 30 instead of 40 this week. You get more time with your family. You get to live a more robust life. You get an extra week off every year, whatever. Instead of saying that, we say, let's just send those profits up to the top. So it's really a public policy issue more so than an automation issue. I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that's what MMT really helps denature is that unemployment is a public choice that we have in order for businesses to somehow have a pool of labor that they sometimes use for cheap product building. So the idea that unemployment being a public choice really helps denature helps show the idea that this is a public policy issue and what we could choose to value for each other. I mean, there would be people that would have to change their income as a result of it, because how many jobs exist right now where people aren't getting paid enough for how clearly valuable they are and getting paid way more for how valuable they think it is, or that banks allow them to finance. I mean, part of I've just seen a lot of research about the BS of accounting and financing. Like if that could be more automated because of the way that we view money, thousands, maybe millions of jobs in accounting right now would just go away. I mean, I love the way MMT talks about healthcare as someone who studied it, because if healthcare becomes the streamlined institution without the bureaucracy, a lot of like the billing services, a lot of the customer service, quality assurance services would go right away. And you need to have those. You can't just leave those people unemployed. We need to have a pool. And I think that's partially to go back to what you were talking about earlier. People in office know that. And I don't know whether they're not imaginative enough to like rhetorically talk about that, or they're not agreeing with it. But that's what's being presented to us, is that once you know this information, you get your blood boiled at the idea of like, why aren't you working on imagining this and talking to people about it?
Yeah. I think you hit on something really key there, and that's like how we like what we value, right? So what do we consider to be a job worth doing just as a society? And you mentioned too, like private institutions are not going to fund something that's not profitable. We know that. But what do we as a society value? What are we willing to prioritize and things like that? And I think a lot of these service jobs could fall into that category. Do you think that lack of understanding in Washington is, you kind of started to touch on this, but do you think that's ignorance, or do you think that's them thinking that the public is so behind on the issue that if they come out and say, I want to spend a bunch, that they're going to sound irresponsible to a general public that equates that with household spending and therefore hurt them at the polls, kind of a thing?
The latter is definitely something Democrats do. I think what you just described is the incentive structure behind MMT in the political sphere in America. Exactly. I like, very well said, because Democrats have to think about that. But the reason our incentive structure is so fucked, and what's happened since 1964, and that no one really, really, really focuses on gerrymandering and the filibuster, is that Republicans don't have to give a shit about that. All they have to do is get 20 to 30% of the population riled up in certain areas, and they don't have to capitulate to our votes. And the problem is that problem has been increasing over time. So different generations of people have different conceptions of that. So for us, it is so vagrantly apparent because it's gotten so bad. But maybe for people that were born in the 80s, it was only just a little bit. You were only just seeing the sights of it. People that were watching certain television programs and getting into computers in cities. But now that rural and city politics has gotten so swayed. And if you've ever heard of contact theory, all that means is Democrats, not Democrats, but cities form this structure where people of different cultures they're down the street. So intrinsically, you're unable to dehumanize them as easier as you would if they were further away. And so that's partially the only reason why Democrats have the sway that they do, is because most people live in cities, and most people that live in cities are also seeing people of different cultures, which makes it harder for them to agree with policies that would dehumanize someone for economic or ethnic value. And because we allow a sway for rural voters, like Ohio is 7 times less important than Wyoming for some reason, even though it's the 6th largest state, that kind of sway is just going to cause it's a form of discrimination, I think, but it's also just going to cause a very mind-numbing sense of what's going on if you're not very, very hyper-focused on those incentive structures.
Absolutely. Yeah, I 100% agree. That's very well said. And if the last thing I want to get to is to kind of tie all this together, at least a couple of these pieces together. If we got to a place where some of those institutional barriers were broken down and we had a populace that understood MMT better, or at least a majority or something understood MMT. How do you see the public reacting to specifically the narratives when a bill like the reconciliation bill comes up of how are we going to pay for it?
Ooh.
Do you see that landing in the same way if we were to break these barriers down, or how would politicians have to react if that was no longer a point that's sold to the public?
Okay, and a part of my article goes into this too, is that I don't want to prescribe too much about what like the alternative future for something that we have not yet realized would be.
Sure.
From my perspective. It's because there's so much beauty in what people could describe about what needs to happen that I have no imagination for. But if people understand that intrinsically, man, who knows? But the step that actually is before that I think is tied to what you're saying is the oh shit moment. I think what we're going to have is a lot of oh shit moments throughout the country of people realizing that this is the case. And I think you're going to see different sways about how people respond to that. I think you're going to see a lot of people being like, well, if money means nothing, well, we can do all of the wars that we want. We can pay for all of the state-run institutions to make sure that women aren't getting abortions. Like we can use the government resources to do all the right-wing things that we want. And that also is a space that exists in other countries too. It's just not very common in America for people to be that blatant about their policies since 1964. But I think that's what you're going to see. You're going to see people be especially since our media is still so right-wing focused, you're probably going to see way more of that first in those oh shit moments. I mean, you're already seeing Tucker Carlson do it a lot. He understands little bits of MMT being these resources that Congress holds. And what he's doing now is spunning up, all of these conspiracies that make people distrust the government. And so once you understand MMT, you're not going to get involved with that conspiratorial understanding of money. Let the elites like Tucker Carlson handle it. So that's sort of the not maybe pessimistic, but darker reaction that I think we're going to see once people start to realize that as Republicans still hold power. But I think what comes out of that is people viewing the interdependence of each other that, man, who knows, right? Like, and part of my article goes into space art and space travel and gaming and the idea that like we're going to start probably developing new art that tells this story, and that's what we're going to start honing into.
That's fantastic stuff. Yeah, absolutely fantastic stuff. Well, Kennedy, first of all, actually, where is that article? I want to plug it.
Oh, it's in its conclusion right now, but it's a 3,000 page worder, but it goes into Star Wars and swap lines. It's going to be a beauty. So I would love for everyone to check it out. Very
much looking forward to reading that. Make sure to the audience that you're following Kennedy on Twitter to make sure you don't miss that article and all of his other content at @the_KMC_. Kennedy, thank you so much for joining again today. I hope to have you on again soon. I always so enjoy our conversations, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Agree, Luke. I look forward to the next time. I really do.
Perfect. Talk to you soon.
Keep up the great work.
I appreciate it. Bye.
All right.
All right. Fantastic segment there, you guys. I'm so thrilled to see Kennedy getting involved with all these other social media platforms and putting this information out there and having these conversations with everybody. He gave me a little bit of optimism. I'm usually such a fucking pessimist about politics, and I appreciate Kennedy injecting a little bit of hope into the discourse today. That was a fantastic segment. Just a couple more stories to get to today. One is actually from the UK, and I usually don't cover UK politics, but I saw this piece, and I think it's very important to get into. Jeremy Corbyn's suspension from the Labour Party. He has now been suspended for over a year for some basically trumped up charges of anti-Semitism. It's a somewhat complicated situation, but I'm going to show you guys an article here in Jacobin that goes into the details. This is by Daniel Finn. Jeremy Corbyn's suspension is a monument to Keir Starmer's political bankruptcy. Labour chief Keir Starmer has now kept his predecessor suspended as a Labour MP on spurious grounds for an entire year. The ongoing saga of Corbyn's suspension perfectly encapsulates the destructive and duplicitous nature of Starmer's leadership. British politics has served up more than its fair share of absurdities in recent times, but the fact that Jeremy Corbyn has now completed a full year of suspension as a Labour MP, having led the party between 2015 and 2019, is in a league of its own. The indictment of Corbyn drawn up by his opponents is so preposterous that it poses a real challenge for anyone whose approach to political discussion is still based on logic and evidence. From the vantage point of 2015, it would have come as no surprise to those familiar with Labour MPs such as Margaret Hodge or Ian Austin that they should be centrally involved in a scandal about racism, but nobody would seriously have expected them to be the chief accusers, pointing their fingers with great indignation at a man whose record of opposing racism is demonstrably superior to that of any Labour leader in modern times. When you know what has actually happened in British politics over the past few years, the experience of reading bog standard newspaper columns that discuss Corbyn and his movement is rather like poring over articles in the Weekly World News about alien abductions and Bigfoot sightings, but without the tacit understanding that this is all a bit of harmless fun. To compound the sense of unreality, anyone who declines to accept the fables of the commentariat is liable to be denounced as a crank, a conspiracy theorist, or a racist, most often by people whose employers pump out toxic bilge about immigrants and ethnic minorities on a regular basis. So they go into the details, and I encourage people to read that story in its entirety if you're interested. But essentially what happened here is a report came out about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Okay. When Jeremy Corbyn addressed this, the first thing he said, the first part of his statement was, anyone who denies that there is anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is wrong. Of course there is. There's anti-Semitism everywhere. That's how he started his statement. And then he went on to add that this was obviously being politically weaponized against him unfairly. And that just is the case, you guys. Jeremy Corbyn is not an anti-Semite. Okay. But what they did is they framed it in a way that kind of inundated them from any form of criticism. So they would make extreme accusations, and then the second they were challenged on those accusations, they would walk it back. And they would misframe their opponent. So when someone defended Corbyn, they would claim that anyone defending Corbyn was purporting that there was no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And that's not what anybody is saying. Everybody acknowledges that anti-Semitism is unfortunately a thing that is everywhere. I mean, any given group is probably going to have some form of anti-Semitism. A major party like that is you're going to be able to find elements that are unpalatable in any given number of ways, right? So Corbyn acknowledged that, but they would try to smear the people defending Jeremy Corbyn of having said that there's no anti-Semitism, right? Which would clearly be absurd. So this whole debate is essentially an attempt to use a sensitive topic to misframe Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters in a way that kind of attacks the very principles that are upheld by that political faction, right? And it's just, to me, it's particularly disgusting to weaponize someone's best intentions against them. It reminds me of oh my God, what was the guy's name? Oh, what was his name? He ran against Richie Neal in Massachusetts, and he was smeared for some sex scandals that he was clearly not guilty of. I covered this so many times, I can't believe the guy's name isn't coming to the top of my mind. It reminds me of that, where it's like, let's weaponize their compassion against them. Just really sad and absurd stuff. And part of the reason I wanted to cover this Corbyn story specifically is because I think there's such a nice parallel between the UK and the US in this regard. I think Corbyn and Bernie were similar phenomenon, kind of driven by similar causes at a similar time. It's like all of the neoliberalism that had been embraced for decades in both countries had caught up kind of at the same moment, and there was this surge, right? So I'm fascinated by that dynamic and the parallels there. And to see, this is exactly what corporate Democrats would have done to Bernie if they could have, but Bernie happens to be Jewish. They even tried a few times, by the way, if anyone remembers. When he would talk about Palestinian rights, they would try to imply, they could never outright say it because, again, Bernie is Jewish, but they would try to imply that Bernie was taking an anti-Semitic position, right? They do this all the time to Ilhan Omar and to Rashida Tlaib for daring to call out AIPAC or for daring to speak on Palestinian rights. They're all of a sudden anti-Semitic for that, right? So it's the weaponization of an identity issue, a sensitive identity issue, in a disingenuous way to appeal to the supporters of your opponent in their appeal to the best nature of your opponent's support. It's just nauseating. It's the dirtiest form of politics. And I think it's worth noting that it has so kind of effectively ostracized Jeremy Corbyn, not in a public perception way so much as just in literally a "we are taking your power away from you" way, right? And that that resonates because of, I think, the similarities there between the UK and the United States in terms of how that kind of conflict line can be exploited by the powers that be in such incredibly disingenuous ways. So I just wanted to note that. I thought this was a really fantastic piece. Daniel Finn, he really went into great detail here and drew the timeline out and explained how each piece of arguments against Corbyn are either deceitful, disingenuous, or both. Great work from Daniel Finn at Jacobin. I encourage you guys to look into that article if this topic happens to catch your interest. And the last story today, you guys, is a weird one. Kamala Harris went on The View. This was a little while ago, but some things have come out now as a result. So just to lay the baseline before we dive into this Daily Beast piece. When Kamala Harris went on The View, two of the hosts on The View, who were the less friendly to the Democrat hosts, right, the more conservative hosts, were taken off the set at the last minute because of they at least this is what the show said, that they had tested positive for COVID. Okay. First of all, serious problem in your testing procedures if you find that out in the middle of the show. You'd think they would know beforehand, right? Make sure that you've passed a test before we go out on set. So there's something there that just doesn't add up. And they went and got tests on their own that came back negative. And they're not doing the rapid tests, you guys. They're doing the good tests. And false positives on those tests are so rare that it really, really raises some questions about, did Kamala's people essentially demand that the hosts, the only two hosts who might have asked a remotely tough question, be taken off of the stage? And then, and this is what we're going to get into in this piece, The View threw their nurse under the bus, a nurse who they had propped up and praised and all this kind of stuff, who had kind of handled the COVID situation for them, handled their testing and the procedures and all this, whatever, right? And they had all been so grateful to this nurse, and they threw her under the bus and they said all this testing shit was her fault. So this is kind of a weird story. This, again, is the Daily Beast. The View ditched its hero nurse after Kamala Harris COVID chaos. The registered nurse was once touted as the talk show's own Florence Nightingale. Jesus. But apparently she had to take the fall for last month's on-air testing meltdown. After two hosts of The View tested positive for COVID-19 while on the air, causing mid-broadcast chaos, generating national headlines, and angering the office of Vice President Kamala Harris, who was waiting backstage, someone had to take the fall. That person appears to have been the show's in-house nurse. Multiple people familiar with the matter told the Daily Beast that following the on-air fiasco late last month, the daytime talk show ditched its health and safety manager, Wendy Livingston, whom the program affectionately referred to as Nurse Wendy, and once labeled a healthcare hero during an effusive tribute. Prior to the television meltdown, which featured hosts Anna Navarro and Sunny Hostin being abruptly yanked off air minutes before a live interview with the vice president, Livingston oversaw The View's regular testing of all personnel, as well as its adherence to coronavirus protocols. But the registered nurse has since stopped performing her medical duties with the show, two people with knowledge of the matter said, though she remains a network employee. Quote, Wendy has not been fired, an ABC spokesperson told the Daily Beast. She remains a part of the health and safety team supporting testing and vaccine verification. CNN reported that Harris's office required all of the show's hosts to take a PCR test within 24 hours of the vice president's live on-set interview. The tests all came back negative, and so, according to CNN, The View's representatives gave the White House the all clear that the show met their requirements for Harris to appear. The White House reportedly felt duped and angered by how the scare unfolded with the Veep in tow. But then, mid-show, Navarro and Hostin were pulled from the set, leaving co-host Joy Behar, I heard that pronounced a number of ways, Behar, and Sarah Haynes scrambling to fill airtime with announcing that their fully vaccinated colleagues had tested positive. Harris was backstage mere moments away from joining the cast at their roundtable set. Vice President did eventually appear on the program, but did so remotely from another room. Harris's office was deeply concerned about the incident, CNN reported, and ABC News President Kim Godwin, who attended the taping, was allegedly irked and embarrassed by the whole fiasco. The mishap was made worse by the fact that Hostin and Navarro tested negative multiple times after what later appeared to have been a false positive at the center of the chaos. Ultimately, it appears the show's executives determined that Livingston had to be removed from The View. So it really looks like they threw their on-air nurse under the bus so that they could appease. This is how it looks to me. No evidence, this is conjecture. It appears as though Kamala or someone in Kamala's camp did not want Navarro and Hostin on that set for that interview because they're the only two that might have asked a remotely tough question of Kamala Harris. That's how it looks to me. So they came up with an excuse to get them off the set. And, just how rare are these false negatives? You guys, you got 2 of them out of 4? Give me a break. Give me a break. Something else happened here, right? And then they come back and test negative over and over again. I mean, something else happened here, you guys. I have no idea what it was. But it's not what they're telling you. And then to throw their nurse under the bus for what was clearly some shenanigans behind the scenes on their own behalf is quite, distasteful to say the least, I suppose. So another Kamala Harris story that is quite cringeworthy, and again, her probably on her reputation repair tour of sorts, attempting to regain any semblance of a positive reputation following what has been a bad beginning to the administration for her. And again, as I noted last week, she wasn't exactly starting from a popular place either. People have never liked Kamala Harris. And, so I just found that story quite interesting. It appears to me that there's some media manipulation going on there, perhaps at the behest of Harris herself or her people. And, just shame on The View for handling this how they've handled it. Shame on The View for throwing their nurse under the bus over the whole situation. Hardly a surprise coming from that particular show, but I thought this was at least worthy of coverage and kind of a, it's kind of a funny little story, I suppose. It again reveals how the press operates, how the corporate media conducts itself, and why you should take everything that they do with not just a grain of salt, but a very large grain of salt. So once again, want to plug realprogressives.org, all sorts of content there. Make sure you're following Kennedy at @the_KMC_. Fantastic segment with him today. Really appreciate him coming on, and look forward to talking to him again in the future. And I hope that you all have a fantastic week, and I'll talk to you next Sunday.